After saving my son's investor's dinner, my daughter-in-law locked me in the pantry and left me there all night. That's not something you forget. The sound of a lock turning while laughter fills the other side of the door. The smell of roasted garlic still in the air, the echo of applause meant for someone else. I sat on the cold tile, surrounded by sacks of flour and olive oil, and listened as they toasted a victory built on my hands and my silence. The Charleston night outside was warm and heavy, pressing against the mansion's windows. From where I sat, I could hear the faint hum of jazz drifting through the garden, the clink of crystal, the practiced laughter of people who mistake noise for power. But to understand how I ended up there, a 68-year-old man, a retired army captain, locked away like an unwanted memory, you have to know what came before that door closed. It started hours earlier, beneath chandeliers, bright enough to blind humility. The Morrison Family Foods investors' dinner, the event that would decide the company's future, was already slipping toward disaster. The chef they'd flown in from Atlanta hadn't shown up. Panic had begun to ripple through the staff like heat. Vanessa, my son's new wife, paced by the grand piano, her silver dress catching every light. "Daniel," she whispered, her smile fixed tight. "The investors are waiting. This can't fall apart." Daniel, my boy, looked cornered, sweat collecting along his collar. I recognized that look. I'd seen it on soldiers before the first bullet flew. He scanned the room, desperate, and his eyes landed on me, standing quietly by the French doors, a guest by blood, a stranger by choice. I set my glass down. "Let me handle it." He hesitated, already embarrassed. "Dad, this isn't—" "Do you want to save the night?" I said. "Or your pride?" Silence cut through the murmurs. I walked past them, through the swinging kitchen doors, into a different kind of battlefield. Chaos, burnt pans, half-cooked pasta, a storm of useless orders. I tied the old blue apron around my waist, Claire's kitchen stitched across the front, the same one my late wife used when she sang while stirring sauce. The smell of basil hit me, and for a second it felt like she was right there, humming in time with my heartbeat. "Quiet," I said, and the noise vanished. Oil hissed, knives chopped, steam rose like prayer. I moved with purpose, rebuilding the meal from ruins, handmade ravioli, smoked tomato sauce, fresh basil torn by hand, the dish Claire loved most. When the plates left the kitchen, I stood by the sink, breathing steady, listening. Then came the applause, the kind that fills a man's chest, even when it isn't meant for him. "Oh, what a masterpiece! Chef Callahan is a genius!" Glasses clinked, laughter rose. My son's name echoed through the hall. Vanessa glowed under the praise, lifting her champagne like a queen who'd won a war. She came to me afterward, perfume thick as sugar. "We can't let them know it was you," she said softly, words sharp enough to cut. "It would ruin Daniel's image. Please, stay in here until it's over." Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and before I could speak, she nodded toward a security guard. The pantry door shut. The lock clicked. The world went quiet. Inside, the air was dense with flour dust and the sour scent of vinegar. I sat down against a crate, feeling the cool metal of Claire's wedding band that hung from a chain around my neck. "You always said pain teaches, Claire," I whispered. "Well, lesson learned." Through the wall I heard another toast, their celebration muffled, distant, unreal. That's when it hit me. I hadn't been locked away for what I'd done wrong. I'd been locked away for what I still represented: honesty, simplicity, the kind of truth that embarrasses the powerful. That night didn't end in the pantry. It began there. Because some battles don't start with a shot. They start with silence. And in that silence, something inside me caught fire. A quiet promise rose from the ashes of humiliation. I would never cook for free again. Not for applause, not for acceptance, and certainly not for them. Some stories remind us what respect really means. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever seen someone's kindness taken for weakness, hit subscribe. You'll want to hear the rest. Grief doesn't end, it just changes its voice. After Claire passed, the house in Charleston grew quieter than any battlefield I'd ever known. No gunfire, no orders, no shouting, just the slow creak of old wood and the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. She'd been gone 3 years, but sometimes I still caught her shadow in the reflection of the oven door or the faint smell of her favorite perfume, gardenia and salt water. For 41 years, she was my compass. Claire Morrison Callahan, the kind of woman who could turn a kitchen into a sanctuary and a storm into a lesson. She taught me that food wasn't just survival, it was communication. Cooking, she'd say, is how you tell someone you still care, even when you don't have the words left. After her funeral, I stopped cooking altogether. Couldn't stand the sound of the frying pan, the hiss of oil, the reminder that her chair at the table would always be empty. I spent months living on cold sandwiches and coffee, staring at walls that used to echo with her voice. Until one Sunday afternoon, I found myself opening the old recipe book she kept in the drawer under the stove. Pages smudged with flour, handwriting slanted and familiar. The first recipe was her favorite, smoked tomato ravioli with basil cream. The same dish I'd made the night they locked me away. I read the notes she'd scribbled in the margins. More salt when you're sad, she'd written once. Less when you're in love. That broke me, but it also made me move. I boiled the water, rolled the dough, followed every line like a prayer. The kitchen filled with steam, and for the first time in months I didn't feel alone. That's when I realized this wasn't cooking, this was conversation. Every stir, every taste was her voice answering back. That's how The Honest Table was born. It started as a small corner restaurant near King Street. 20 seats, one chalkboard menu, no reservations. I didn't plan for it to succeed. I just needed somewhere to keep talking to her. But Charleston has a way of listening to sincerity. The locals came, one by one, fishermen, teachers, tired parents, a few old soldiers who recognized the look in my eyes. They said my food tasted like home that's been lost. I didn't know what that meant, but I took it as a compliment. 4 years later, The Honest Table became a name people whispered with warmth. Then came the second location, then a third. People said my cooking had soul. I never corrected them, because the soul they were tasting wasn't mine, it was hers. While I rebuilt something out of grief, my son, Daniel, was building something out of ambition. He'd inherited control of his mother's family business, Morrison Family Foods, a respected local pasta company started in 1979. I wanted to believe he'd honor the Morrison name. For a while he did. He ran the business with his fiancée, Eleanor Wyatt, a quiet, capable woman who'd been with him through the rough years of his mother's illness. Together, they kept the company steady, the employees loyal, the recipes authentic. Then, somewhere along the way, Daniel decided authenticity wasn't enough. He traded stability for speed, broke off his engagement to Eleanor with an email and a bottle of champagne waiting for someone else, Vanessa Reed, his secretary at the time. She was young, sharp, beautiful, in the way ambition often is, all shine, no warmth. Within months they were married. Within a year, the company started bleeding money. I watched from afar as Morrison Family Foods became a showpiece instead of a legacy. New logos, flashy commercials, modern cuisine events with more photographers than chefs. The numbers looked good at first, until they didn't. Too many parties, too many gifts, too much debt. Vanessa loved appearances. Daniel loved her approval, and I loved them both enough to stay quiet longer than I should have. But silence has a way of corroding the soul. Every Sunday, I still cooked at home, alone, wearing that blue apron. Sometimes Daniel would visit for dinner, sometimes he wouldn't. When he did, he sat through the meal, scrolling through his phone, pretending to listen. Vanessa came once, just once, and I'll never forget what she said. I served her Claire's ravioli. She tasted it, smiled politely, then laughed. "It's good," she said, "but it tastes like nostalgia, like something from a time that doesn't exist anymore." Daniel laughed too lightly to please her. I didn't respond. I just nodded and kept eating. But inside, something cracked. Not anger, not sadness, just recognition. That was the moment I realized my son wasn't ashamed of me because I failed him. He was ashamed of me because I reminded him of everything real he'd abandoned. Still, I kept visiting their world when invited. The company galas, the ribbon cuttings, the charity luncheons. Every time I was introduced as Daniel's father, never as the founder of the Honest Table. When people complimented my restaurant, Daniel would smile and say, "Yeah, Dad's hobby keeps him busy." A hobby. Funny thing, though, hobbies don't usually feed 100 employees. But I didn't argue. I'd learned long ago that defending your worth to the wrong people only cheapens it. So I smiled and cooked and waited, because life always circles back, sometimes slowly, sometimes cruelly, but always truthfully. I just didn't know yet how far that circle would turn, or that one night inside a glittering mansion full of strangers, I'd be the man who saved his son's company, only to be locked away like an inconvenient memory. The humiliation came quietly, dressed as opportunity. A few weeks after that night in the pantry, Daniel called me as if nothing had happened. His voice carried the forced cheer of someone who believes that pretending makes it true. "Dad," he said, "a TV network wants to feature the company in a special about Southern cuisine. They loved your ravioli from the investors' dinner. Would you come help me recreate it on camera?" I said yes, because old soldiers know that some battles must be walked through, not around. The studio was set up like a movie scene. Bright lights, polished counters, cameras gliding on rails. Behind the glass, producers whispered into headsets. Vanessa stood by Daniel, dressed immaculately, every detail curated to look effortless. I wore the same apron, the same calm. It wasn't pride that brought me there, but closure. I wanted to see what truth would do under fluorescent light. Daniel began the introduction with charm that bordered on performance. "This recipe," he said, smiling into the camera, "has been in my family for generations." He didn't look at me when he said it. The host, a woman with perfect teeth and the practiced warmth of television, gestured toward me. "And who do we have here? The original chef?" Daniel laughed, too loudly. "He's just here to make sure I don't burn the kitchen down." The audience chuckled. Vanessa's smile froze in place. We started cooking. The camera zoomed in on my son's hands as he rolled the pasta dough. He pressed too hard, rushing, his movements impatient. I watched silently, waiting for the rhythm of the kitchen to settle, but it never did. The dough tore, the sauce burned. The smell changed from comfort to warning. I reached forward to lower the heat, but Vanessa shot me a look, a warning of her own. "Let him handle it," she whispered through clenched teeth. So I stepped back and let gravity finish what arrogance had begun. The sauce curdled on live television. The ravioli broke apart. The host tried to mask her discomfort, but the camera caught everything. The sour smoke, the awkward laughter, the sound of failure stretching across the set. Daniel's jaw tightened. "What the hell happened?" he hissed. I said nothing. Then I noticed the labels on the ingredient jars, the company's own products. The flour had been stored too long. The tomatoes were past date. Their empire was rotting from the inside out, and now the world could taste it. Vanessa's voice sliced through the silence. "He did this on purpose," she said, pointing at me, her tone rising. "He sabotaged us. He's jealous." The accusation landed like a slap in public. The crew froze. Daniel's face twisted with anger and humiliation. "If you can't even cook anymore," he shouted, "then maybe you don't belong in the house my mother built." The words hung in the air, heavier than smoke. I looked at him. My son, the same boy who once ran barefoot through our kitchen, chasing Claire's laughter. and realized he no longer saw me as family, only as something to erase. Without a word, I untied the apron and folded it neatly on the counter. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every quiet movement as I gathered my coat and small brown suitcase. I didn't defend myself. Some truths don't need witnesses to stand tall. When I reached the hallway, the air outside the studio felt colder, sharper. I could hear Daniel behind me, still arguing, still blaming. But another voice cut through the noise, soft, steady, familiar. "Mr. Callahan," said Helena. She stood near the exit, dressed plainly, her hair tied back, holding a clipboard. She had been there all along, consulting for the show's production team. I hadn't noticed her until that moment. "You don't have to say anything," she said. Her eyes were calm, but I could see something new there, resolve. She stepped forward and picked up the suitcase that had slipped slightly from my grasp. "Let me help you." As we walked out, I noticed the curve of her stomach beneath her loose blouse, subtle but unmistakable. I didn't mention it. Some truths reveal themselves when they're ready. The evening light spilled across the parking lot, orange and forgiving. Eleanor opened the passenger door of her car, but I stopped her. "I'll be fine," I said. "You've already done enough." She smiled, faint and sad. "Not yet," she replied. Then she drove away, leaving the scent of lavender and hope in the air. I stood there for a long time, watching the studio doors close behind me, thinking about how easily people trade legacy for applause. That day, I didn't feel angry. I felt light, almost free. It's strange how exile can feel like release when you've been suffocating in someone else's story. That night, I returned to my apartment above the honest table. I brewed coffee in my old French press, turned on the radio, Sinatra, of course, and sat by the window overlooking King Street. The restaurant below was still open, laughter and the clatter of dishes rising through the floorboards. Life continued. My hands, stained with tomato and flour, didn't tremble. They just rested, calm, waiting for whatever came next. I thought of Claire, and for the first time since her death I felt her approval, not through words or dreams, but through silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of meaning. I realized I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The world has a way of seeing truth eventually, no matter how many locks or lies try to hide it. Still, part of me knew this wasn't over, not because I wanted revenge, but because dignity has a memory. And sooner or later, it calls for balance. My son had chosen spectacle over soul, and the price was already being written into the ledger of consequence. I didn't have to lift a finger. Time was doing it for me. I closed the radio, turned off the lights, and whispered into the quiet, "Good night, Claire." The city breathed outside, steady and alive. Somewhere between the hum of traffic and the salt wind, I heard her answer. Not with words, but with warmth. And that was enough to remind me that even when the world locks you away, it can't silence who you are. Exile didn't announce itself with thunder. It simply arrived and stayed, moving through the days like mist until the outlines of my old life disappeared. The morning after the television disaster, I carried what was left of my belongings up a narrow staircase to the small apartment above the honest table. The space was simple. A bed that creaked, a window overlooking King Street, the faint hum of traffic below mixing with the clatter of dishes from the restaurant. It was quiet, not empty, just honest. I told myself that if I could keep a routine, I could keep my balance. Dawn began with the knock of the baker delivering fresh loaves, and I met him at the back door like clockwork, testing the warmth of each baguette with my palm. Mornings were for cleaning, sharpening knives, tasting sauces, and listening to the steady rhythm of a kitchen that reminded me I was still useful. By noon, the dining room filled with conversations, the kind that floated gently without urgency. The sound of contentment became my new prayer. In the afternoons, I read invoices, checked deliveries, and ignored the rumors that trickled through Charleston's small but merciless social circles. Some said I'd sabotaged my son out of jealousy. Others claimed I'd been drunk or bitter or mad. Gossip is lazy. It travels faster than truth because it doesn't stop to breathe. I didn't defend myself. Silence is not weakness. It's armor that keeps a man's dignity from being auctioned off in public. When you've lived through loss, you learn that the truth doesn't need your permission to survive. It simply waits for the noise to die down. Evenings brought the smell of tomato and garlic, Sinatra on the radio, the same blue apron tied at my waist. The restaurant pulsed beneath me like a heartbeat, and the regulars returned again and again, drawn not by novelty but by sincerity. Some of them asked about my son's company, their voices careful, testing. I said only that business is like bread. It rises best when the hands shaping it are clean. They nodded, perhaps understanding more than I intended to say. After closing, I climbed the stairs to my small apartment, muscles aching from the long day, the kind of pain that feels like proof of living. Sometimes I set 2 plates out by instinct before putting one back, the habit of companionship refusing to die. I talked to Claire while washing dishes, thanking her for the small victories, a perfect sauce, a kind customer, another day without bitterness. Weeks passed, and the city began to whisper. Morrison Family Foods was faltering. Deliveries arrived late, quality complaints spread online, and one morning Lydia, the same housekeeper who had once opened the pantry door, appeared behind the restaurant, carrying an envelope. She pressed it into my hand, her eyes steady. "I didn't see anything," she said, "but I know what I didn't see." Inside were photocopies of internal reports from the factory, batches of spoiled tomatoes approved for distribution, signed not by my son, but by Vanessa. I read the papers without surprise. Proof, when it arrives, rarely feels like victory. It's just confirmation of what your heart already learned the hard way. I stopped buying their products immediately and switched to smaller local suppliers. The ingredients were humbler but alive, still breathing when I touched them. My restaurant's costs rose, but so did the flavor. Meanwhile, Morrison's decline accelerated. A recall notice appeared in the newspaper, and a lawsuit followed soon after. Investors began to distance themselves, their compliments turning cautious. Some even came to dine at the honest table, pretending to visit out of curiosity, but their eyes betrayed calculation. They spoke softly about financial instability and governance concerns, phrases that mean a ship is taking water. I served them dinner, said little, and listened. Later, I wrote down their names in a notebook I kept under my mattress next to Lydia's envelope. The quiet weeks that followed shaped me more than any battlefield ever did. I worked, rested, prayed in my own way, and found a peace I hadn't known since before Claire's illness. Sometimes I cooked for the church's community dinners, standing shoulder to shoulder with volunteers who never asked what had happened, but always saved me a plate. Service is a kind of medicine when pride has been wounded. It reminds you that usefulness is worth more than reputation. Yet even peace carries its own shadow. At dusk, when the last candle in the dining room flickered out, I would feel the weight of solitude settling around me like an extra coat. There were moments I almost forgave Daniel in silence, until I remembered the look in his eyes when he told me I didn't belong in his mother's house. Some words don't wash off, even after you stop resenting them. By the end of the year, the company was crumbling. A supplier filed a lawsuit. Another demanded payment for overdue shipments. A local news segment mentioned financial irregularities. The billboards disappeared from the highways, leaving pale ghosts of letters where the glue had held. I didn't call my son, and he didn't call me. I had nothing left to prove, and he had everything left to lose. My revenge was patience, the kind that waits for the truth to find its way home. On Thursday afternoon, the kitchen smelled of simmering sauce, and I was plating the first special of the night when a courier climbed the back steps with an envelope marked with the Morrison seal. My name was written in Daniel's handwriting, tight, precise, familiar. Inside was a formal letter, notice of an emergency shareholders meeting at the company headquarters in North Charleston. The phrases were sterile but urgent. material discrepancies, operational audit, leadership restructuring. In other words, the storm had arrived. I folded the paper once, slid it into my notebook, and returned to the stove. My hands were steady as I stirred the sauce, the flame low and steady beneath the pan. Through the window, the evening sky was the same color as the tomatoes in the pot, deep, bruised red. Some endings don't need trumpets, they just need time. As I tasted for salt, I realized the next chapter wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about restoring what should never have been broken. The dignity of work, the legacy of honesty, the name that belonged to Claire, and no longer to the people who had forgotten her. The letter summoned me back into a world I thought I had already buried. The Morrison headquarters in North Charleston stood like a monument to ambition, a glass tower that caught the sunlight and turned it cold. I hadn't walked through those doors since Claire's funeral. That morning, I put on my old Navy suit, polished my shoes until I could see the window behind me in their shine, and drove in silence along the Ashley River. The city was waking slowly. Shrimp boats moving through the mist, church bells echoing faintly. I didn't feel nervous, just deliberate, like a man walking toward a final inspection. When I arrived, the lobby smelled of lemon polish and fear. Assistants moved quickly, whispering into phones. The receptionist looked up and hesitated, recognizing me from framed photographs that had probably been taken down long ago. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice cautious. "They're expecting you in conference room A." The way she avoided my eyes told me everything. People inside that room were already deciding which side of history they wanted to stand on. The meeting had already begun. Round the long mahogany table sat 12 investors, most of them restless, checking their watches. At the far end, Daniel was presenting slides, charts that glowed on the wall behind him, filled with numbers that rose where they should have fallen. Vanessa sat to his left, smiling as if she were auditioning for calm. When the door clicked shut behind me, every head turned. Daniel froze for half a breath, then forced a grin that never reached his eyes. "Dad," he said, "you didn't have to come." "Your letter said otherwise," I replied, taking a seat at the far end of the table. The screen changed to another graph. Profits, projections, promises. I watched the lines climb like lies built on scaffolding. When he finished, there was polite applause. An investor named Mr. Patel cleared his throat. "We appreciate the optimism, Daniel," he said, "but the auditor's preliminary report doesn't match these figures. There are inconsistencies." Daniel stiffened. "Minor discrepancies," he said quickly. "We're resolving them." Vanessa leaned forward. "If I may, the market has been unpredictable." "That's not what this says," interrupted another voice. It was one of the older partners, a woman named Dr. Samuels, who had once sat beside Claire at every annual banquet. She turned toward me. "Mr. Callahan, you've reviewed the data, haven't you?" All eyes shifted. I opened the leather folder I'd brought, Lydia's documents, printouts from the State Food Inspection site, bank transfers I'd traced through public filings, and a list of investors who had quietly moved their capital to the Honest Tables Expansion Fund. "Yes," I said, "I have." The air changed temperature. I spoke slowly, without anger, just precision. For over a year, operating expenses have been recorded as marketing budgets. Supplier payments redirected to personal accounts, product quality ignored to maintain appearance. And every time an employee raised a concern, it was silenced in the name of image. The company that once carried my wife's name has become a mirror of my son's ego. The words landed with the weight of paperwork and truth combined. Daniel tried to interrupt, but the room was already listening elsewhere. I placed one final document on the table. Proof that half of the investors from that infamous dinner had quietly moved their contracts to my restaurant group, forming a new cooperative focused on ethical sourcing and sustainability. "The ones you tried to impress," I said, "decided to invest in integrity instead." Vanessa's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. "This is absurd," she snapped. He's manipulating you. He's always resented Daniel's success." Her tone cracked at the edges. "Look at him, sitting there like some martyr. You think this man, this washed-up cook, has the right to lecture us about business?" I met her gaze without blinking. "You're right about one thing," I said. "I am washed of pretense, washed of greed, washed of the need to be admired by people who mistake wealth for worth." I turned to the board. "But you all know what happens when truth is ignored too long. It rots, just like your products have." For a moment, no one moved. Then Dr. Samuels closed her notebook and said, "We've heard enough." She called for a vote. One by one, hands lifted, 11-1. The motion passed. Daniel was to step down pending investigation. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Daniel stared at me, his mouth open but no words forming. Vanessa sat down slowly, pale now, her bravado leaking out like air from a balloon. "You planned this," she whispered. "You wanted to humiliate him." I shook my head. "I didn't plan anything. I just stopped protecting him from the consequences of his choices." The head of the board turned to me. "Mr. Callahan, the shareholders propose interim leadership until the company stabilizes. Would you be willing to return?" I smiled, small, tired, but certain. No. This was never meant to come back to me. I turned toward the door, then paused. "There's someone else who understands this company's heart better than any of us." And as if summoned by memory, Eleanor stepped quietly from the hallway, having been asked to attend as a consultant. Her presence drew a murmur through the room. She looked surprised, but not uncertain. "She kept the company alive when Claire was sick," I said. "She built trust with the workers, and she never sold dignity for convenience. If this name deserves another chance, it should be through her." The board conferred briefly. Then the chairman nodded. "Agreed." The decision was unanimous. Eleanor was appointed interim director, effective immediately. She turned to me, eyes bright with disbelief. "Richard, are you sure?" I nodded. "Legacies belong to those who protect them, not to those who inherit them." Daniel slumped back in his chair, the reality of loss finally settling on his shoulders. I wanted to reach out to him, but some lessons can't be taught by touch. They have to be lived. As I walked toward the exit, Vanessa's voice followed, sharp and trembling. "You've ruined us!" I stopped at the door and looked back. "No," I said quietly. "You ruined yourselves. I just turned on the light." Outside, the late afternoon heat hit like truth itself, unforgiving, necessary, clean. I loosened my tie, took a breath, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, the calm of completion. Inside that glass building, power had changed hands. But what mattered more was that respect, long buried under pride and noise, had found its way back to the surface. The meeting ended, but the echoes stayed. I left the boardroom before anyone could thank or question me, walking through the lobby where sunlight slanted against the marble floor in long, cold lines. Outside, the air smelled of cut grass and diesel. The parking lot shimmered in the heat, and I thought about how still the world could feel right after something irreversible happens. Some victories don't make noise. They just breathe differently. By the time I reached the car, Daniel was already behind me. "Dad!" he shouted, his voice cracking through the glass doors. I turned. He was half running, half stumbling, his tie loosened, the perfect son's armor gone. He stopped a few feet away, trying to find words. For a moment, he looked like the boy I used to carry on my shoulders to the edge of the river, where we'd watch shrimp boats crawl across the horizon. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You didn't have to embarrass me in front of everyone." "Embarrass you?" I asked quietly. "I told the truth. You embarrassed yourself the moment you started pretending it didn't matter." He laughed, sharp and defensive. "You think you're some kind of hero? You spent years judging me, waiting for me to fail." His voice wavered, the anger thinner than he meant it to be. "You always thought Mom's company should have been yours." I shook my head. "No, son. I thought it should have been honest. That's not the same thing. He looked down at the asphalt, jaw tightening. "They're saying Eleanor's taking over. You planned that, didn't you?" "She earned it," I said. "You just didn't notice, because she never raised her voice to prove it." He kicked at a pebble, like a child again. The sound of it skittering away was the only movement between us. "You loved her once," I said. "I saw how she steadied you when the world shook. And now you'll see how it feels to be held accountable by someone who still remembers what this company was built for." He looked up sharply. "She's going to destroy everything I built. She's going to save what's left of what your mother built," I corrected. There was no anger left in my tone, only fact. Sometimes saving something means burning away the parts that rot. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The cicadas were loud in the trees beyond the parking lot, filling the silence like static. Daniel rubbed his face, the lines of stress already carving their early claim. "I don't even know how to start over," he said finally. "Everything's gone." "Not everything," I said. "You still have your hands. You still have your name, even if you've tarnished it. And you still have time. Use it better than I did." He looked at me, eyes glassy. "What do you mean better than you did?" "I spent too long mistaking endurance for wisdom," I said. "Thought that silence was strength, that forgiveness meant absence of consequence. But silence without clarity breeds resentment. I should have told you the truth sooner, that love without discipline isn't kindness, it's cowardice. I let you drift too far before I drew a line." He swallowed hard. "Is that what this is? A line?" "It's a beginning," I said, "if you want it to be." Behind us, the building's glass reflected the two of us standing there, two men who looked more like brothers in weariness than father and son in lineage. For a second, I could almost see Claire's reflection beside us, her expression half proud, half aching. Daniel followed my gaze and whispered, "She'd hate me if she knew what I've done." "She'd forgive you," I said, "but she'd never excuse you. There's a difference." I stepped closer, close enough to smell the expensive cologne that couldn't hide the fatigue beneath it. "Son, guilt isn't meant to crush you. It's meant to guide you back." His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. "I don't know where to go," he said softly. "Then start where you should have stayed," I told him. "At the ground level. Learn the work again. Learn the people. Learn what hunger looks like from the kitchen instead of the conference table." He nodded, almost imperceptibly. "And if Eleanor allows it," I added, "listen to her. She carries more of your mother's grace than either of us deserves." Daniel blinked hard, tears threatening but refusing. "Why did you never give up on me?" I smiled, a small, tired thing. "Because your mother never gave up on me. And some debts you don't pay with words. You pay by passing the lesson forward." He looked away, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "What happens now?" "You work," I said. "You fall, you rebuild, you stay quiet long enough to hear your own heart again. And maybe someday you make something good out of the ruins." I placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, nothing ceremonial, just the simplest kind of human contact. "It's your turn to learn what honest work feels like." He nodded once, eyes fixed on the pavement. I turned toward my car, but before opening the door, I heard his voice again, lower this time, stripped of pride. "Dad," he said. "I'm sorry." I didn't answer immediately. I looked at him over the roof of the car, saw the sincerity sitting awkwardly beside shame, and said, "Good, now let the apology grow legs, let it walk." Then I got in and drove away. The road back to Charleston shimmered with afternoon heat. Spanish moss swayed above the water, and somewhere between the bridges I felt a weight lift, not because everything was forgiven, but because the truth had finally spoken loud enough to silence the lies. When I reached King Street, the restaurant was alive with its usual rhythm. Ramon waved from the kitchen, Mia balanced trays, laughter drifted through the open door. I hung my jacket by the office door and stepped behind the line, rolling up my sleeves. The smell of basil rose to meet me, sharp and green, and I thought of Claire again. Somewhere out there, my son was beginning his fall back into humility, and I hoped it would catch him softly enough to leave him whole. I stirred the sauce, tasted for salt, and whispered, "That's enough for today, Claire." And for the first time in years, the kitchen didn't echo back emptiness. It answered with warmth. Months passed quietly, the way winter slides into spring when no one is watching. The scandal around Morrison family foods faded from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher gossip. People moved on, as they always do. But in Charleston, memory lingers like humidity. It never really leaves. It just changes shape. The company survived under Helena's care, not because of luck, but because she understood that redemption starts with small, consistent truths. She visited the factories herself, listened to the workers, replaced glossy campaigns with transparent reports. The Morrison name began to recover, not as a symbol of glamour, but as a promise of integrity. From a distance, I watched it all like a man studying a fire he no longer needed to tend. Daniel stayed silent for a long time. I heard from others that he had sold the mansion, the cars, the watches, everything that once spoke louder than his character. He moved into a modest townhouse near Sullivan's Island, started showing up at the office before dawn, working under Helena's direction like any other employee. It couldn't have been easy, but humility never is. One evening, after closing the restaurant, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a simple note in his handwriting. "I'm learning. Thank you for letting the silence teach me what pride never could." There was no signature. He didn't need one. Life found its rhythm again. The honest table grew slowly, quietly, like something planted with care instead of ambition. I spent my days in the kitchen and my evenings by the window, the radio murmuring old songs while the scent of tomato and basil settled into the walls. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the glass and see a man at peace with his own survival. Sometimes I'd talk to Claire in my head, updating her on the small victories. A young couple getting engaged at table 3, a new chef perfecting her first sauce, a sunset that painted the river copper and gold. I didn't know if she could hear me. Maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that I kept talking anyway. One afternoon, Ramon burst into the kitchen, cheeks flushed. "Mr. Callahan," he said, breathless. "Eleanor's at the hospital. The baby's coming." For a second I didn't understand. Then the words found their weight, and I realized what they meant. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and drove through the rain-soaked streets toward the Medical University of South Carolina Hospital. The sky was a dull silver, the kind that makes everything look washed clean. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, sitting alone in the hallway outside the maternity ward. His eyes were tired but steady, his hands clasped together like a man holding on to something fragile and sacred. He looked up when I approached. "She's inside," he said quietly. "They said it could be any minute now." There was a long pause between us, filled with things neither of us needed to say. For once, silence didn't hurt. It just existed, gentle and human. A nurse appeared a few minutes later, smiling. "You can come in now." The room smelled of antiseptic and new beginnings. Eleanor lay in bed, exhausted but glowing in that strange, luminous way only mothers can. When she saw me, her smile softened. "You made it," she whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting on hers. Both of them turned toward the small bassinet beside the bed. Inside, wrapped in a white blanket, was a newborn girl with a faint tuft of brown hair and a face so peaceful it silenced everything around her. "She's beautiful," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Her name is Claire," she said softly. The sound of it nearly broke me. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It was as if the world had folded in on itself, past and present, touching for a heartbeat. I looked at Daniel. His eyes glistened, and for once there was no pride left in them, only gratitude. "I wanted her to carry something good from all of this," he said. "Something that lasts." I stepped closer to the crib and reached down, my fingers trembling slightly as I touched the baby's tiny hand. It closed around my finger with the strength of pure instinct. Warm. Alive. Forgiving, without knowing what forgiveness was. I felt the same calm I used to feel when Claire would hum beside the stove, her voice floating through the kitchen like sunlight. "Welcome home, little one," I whispered. "You carry a name that's seen both fire and grace." Eleanor reached out her hand toward me. "She'll grow up knowing who you are," she said, "what you stood for." I shook my head gently. "Just make sure she knows who she's named after," I said. "That's more than enough." The rain outside had stopped, leaving streaks on the hospital window that caught the evening light like silver threads. Daniel turned to me then, his voice low, sincere. "Dad, I'm sorry for everything." This time he didn't just say it. He lived it in his tone. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "The past doesn't need to disappear," I said. "It just needs to stop leading the way." He nodded slowly, looking down at the baby again. "You think she'll forgive me too?" "She already has," I said. "She was born forgiving." The nurse returned quietly to adjust the blankets. The room was filled with the gentle hum of machines and the rhythm of a new heartbeat. I stood there watching my son, the woman he'd once broken now whole again, and the child that bore the name of the woman who'd taught me everything about love and endurance. It felt like the world had come full circle, not in triumph, but in grace. After a while, I stepped toward the window. The city lights shimmered across the river, and the scent of rain mingled with the antiseptic air. I whispered, "Mission accomplished, Claire. The table's full again." And for the first time since she died, I didn't feel her absence as pain. I felt it as presence, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to be real. Recognition doesn't always come as applause. Sometimes it arrives disguised as an ordinary day. 3 months after the birth of baby Claire, Charleston prepared for its annual Food and Heritage Festival, a week-long celebration of the city's culinary roots. The Honest Table had been invited before, but this time was different. They wanted me to close the event with a live demonstration on the main stage, honoring Charleston's culinary legacy. I almost declined. Public praise had never sat comfortably on my shoulders. But Ramon insisted. "You owe it to her," he said, meaning all the Claires who'd ever held a family together with recipes instead of speeches. So I agreed, quietly, without expectation. The morning of the festival was bright and restless. The air carried the scent of river salt and roasted peanuts from the street vendors. White tents stretched across Marion Square, each sheltering laughter, clatter, and stories thick with heritage. When I arrived, volunteers were setting up the stage, cast-iron pans lined in a neat row, microphones waiting like open hands. I slipped into my old blue apron, the one with Claire's kitchen still faintly visible across the chest. And for a moment I thought of her humming beside the stove. Then I heard a voice behind me. "Looks like the city finally caught up to you," said Eleanor, smiling. She was holding the baby, now a chubby bundle wrapped in yellow. "She's getting heavy," I said. "Good," Eleanor replied. "It means she's staying." Daniel joined them moments later, carrying boxes of fresh basil and tomatoes. His posture was different now, no longer inflated, no longer brittle, just human. "I thought you might need these," he said. I took the box, studying his face. The pride was still there, but it had learned how to bow. "Thanks, son," I said, and meant it. Behind him, banners fluttered in the mild wind. Charleston honors its own. The festival crowd gathered as the afternoon light softened. Tourists, locals, old neighbors, even a few reporters. I began the demonstration not with words, but with rhythm. The steady scrape of a knife against a board, the sizzle of garlic meeting oil, the low hum of simmering tomatoes. People leaned in, not for spectacle, but for the comfort of familiarity. "This dish," I finally said into the microphone, "isn't about innovation. It's about memory. It's about what we keep alive when time tries to take it away." I told them how Claire used to say that cooking was conversation, that every meal was a letter you wrote to the people you loved. The audience went quiet, listening like a congregation without pews. I didn't look for Daniel, but I felt his presence just beyond the lights. As I plated the final ravioli, Eleanor stepped forward, carrying the baby. She whispered something to one of the organizers, and before I knew it, the announcer was back at the microphone. "Before we close, we have a small presentation," he said. "In honor of his contribution to Charleston's culinary soul and to the legacy of the Morrison family, we present Captain Richard Samuel Callahan with the Heritage Flame Award." The applause rose slowly at first, then swelled into something that filled the square. The trophy itself was simple, bronze shaped like a small rising flame, but the weight in my hands was heavier than any medal I'd ever earned. For a moment I couldn't move. The crowd blurred into light and sound. Then I saw Daniel step onto the stage beside me, uninvited but welcome. He turned to the microphone, his voice low but clear. "This man taught me what it means to build something honest. I didn't understand it when it mattered most, but I do now. Everything that bears our name exists because he refused to give up on us." His voice cracked, and the audience murmured, sensing something raw and real. "Dad," he said, turning to me, "thank you for fighting the battles I was too proud to see." He extended his hand. I didn't take it at first. I looked at him, at the young man who had once thought arrogance could fill the space that discipline left behind. Then I took his hand and pulled him into a brief, steady embrace. The crowd applauded again, but this time it felt like silence breaking open into light. Eleanor wiped her eyes discreetly. The baby gurgled as if echoing the applause. Somewhere I imagined Claire laughing, the sound soft, familiar, unburdened. When the ceremony ended, people lined up to greet us. Some wanted photographs, others wanted recipes, but most just wanted to say thank you. They spoke about their own families, their own losses, their own attempts at starting over. A man in his 70s told me that after his wife's death, he'd been afraid to cook because every smell reminded him of her. "Now I think maybe that's the point," he said, and I nodded, understanding. Connection is the only ingredient that never spoils. As the sun dipped low over the city, Daniel and I walked together through the emptying park. The air was cool now, sweet with magnolia and smoke from the food stalls being taken down. He carried the baby on his shoulder, her tiny head resting in the curve of his neck. "She's got your eyes," I said. "Then she'll see the world better than I did," he replied. We both laughed quietly. No bitterness left between us, just the quiet rhythm of forgiveness. Back at the restaurant that night, I placed the Heritage Flame trophy on the counter near the register, not behind glass, but where anyone could touch it. I didn't want it to be a relic. I wanted it to remind people that legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn, one honest act at a time. Ramon suggested moving it to the front window, but I shook my head. "Let it stay close to the fire," I said. "That's where it belongs." Later, after the staff had gone and the lights dimmed, I sat at my usual table with a glass of water and looked at the empty chairs. The applause had faded, but peace remained. I thought of the long road that had brought me here, of shame, of patience, of the small mercies that shape survival. Outside, the river wind carried the faint scent of rain, and in that moment I realized something simple. Redemption isn't a destination. It's a kitchen that never closes. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain had returned, brushing softly against the restaurant windows, the sound steady and forgiving. King Street was quiet, its reflections stretching across the wet pavement like threads of silver. I sat alone at the corner table, the same one Claire and I had once shared after long shifts when the world still felt endless. The award from the festival rested nearby, catching the dim light from the lamp above. I wasn't looking at it, though. My eyes were on the blank sheet of paper in front of me and the pen I had been turning over in my hand for almost an hour. I hadn't written to Claire in years. After she died, words felt too heavy, too final, as if putting them down would admit she was truly gone. But tonight felt different. The house, the company, the pride, the noise. Everything that had once tried to define me had burned away. What remained was quieter, smaller, but clean. Maybe that's what peace really is. Not the absence of struggle, but the acceptance of what can't be undone. I began to write. My Claire. It's late, and Charleston is half asleep. The restaurant's quiet now, except for the drip of rain through the gutter and the hum of the cooler downstairs. I thought you'd like to know that your name lives on. She's tiny, beautiful, and loud when she wants to be. They call her Baby Claire, but when she looks at me, I see you. I see every morning we built from scratch and every night we survived by faith and stubbornness. I thought your passing would be the end of our story, but it turns out it was only an intermission. You were right about the kitchen. It teaches patience, mercy, and timing. 3 things I spent a lifetime trying to learn too late. You also said that cooking for someone is an act of hope. I think that's why I kept doing it, even when nobody wanted what I had to give. Hope needs a vessel, and mine has always been a pot of sauce on the stove. Daniel's learning. Slowly, awkwardly, but learning. I saw it in his hands when he held his daughter. He doesn't reach for applause anymore. He reaches for purpose. Maybe that's the best kind of redemption there is. The kind that doesn't erase the scars, but lets you grow around them. Eleanor forgave him long before I did, and I think that saved him. It reminded me of you. You always said forgiveness wasn't a gift. It was a discipline. I used to argue that some people didn't deserve it. Now I know that forgiveness isn't for them. It's for the ones who need to stop bleeding. The restaurant's steady. We opened a new location downtown last month, but it doesn't feel like expansion. It feels like memory taking root. I still keep your apron folded by the stove. Sometimes, when the night's long and the orders never end, I touch the embroidery and it steadies my hands. Claire's kitchen. You'd laugh to see how many people ask who Claire was. I always tell them the truth. She was the soul of the recipe. I paused then, looking at the ink drying on the page. The words weren't tidy. They wandered, like grief learning to breathe again. I folded the letter once, twice, and slipped it into the notebook I kept under the counter. Maybe I'd never show it to anyone. Maybe I didn't have to. Some letters only need to be written, not read. Outside, the streetlights flickered as the rain slowed. I stepped to the window and watched the water collect in the gutter, carrying the day's dust away. Across the street, the reflection of my restaurant sign shimmered on the wet asphalt. The honest table, soul in every bite. Claire had come up with that line years ago, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a smudge of flour on her cheek. Back then, I thought it was just a slogan. Now I know it was a philosophy, an instruction manual for living. The soul isn't in the success. It's in the persistence. I turned off the lights and walked through the empty dining room, my footsteps echoing softly. The chairs stood on tables, their legs reaching upward like prayer. I stopped by the counter, where the small bronze flame from the festival glowed faintly in the streetlight. My fingers brushed its edge. "We made it, love," I said quietly. Not the way we planned, but the way we were meant to. The words didn't echo. They settled. Before leaving, I checked the kitchen one last time. The pans were clean, the counters gleamed, and the scent of basil lingered like a benediction. I stood still for a long moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the clock. Sounds that had outlived arguments, ambitions, and heartbreaks. The world keeps moving, I thought, not because it forgets, but because it forgives. Outside, the air was cool and damp. I walked toward the river, the city lights trembling on the surface of the water. Every breath felt easier, every step lighter. Somewhere behind me, a window opened, and I could hear laughter spilling from one of the apartments above the shops, young voices, alive and unburdened. It made me smile. Life was still happening, indifferent and beautiful as it should be. When I reached the edge of the pier, I leaned against the rail, watching the slow current carry the reflections away. I imagined Claire beside me, her hand slipping into mine, not as memory but as presence. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of time, of lessons, of everything we had managed to hold together even after life had tried to scatter it. "Mission accomplished," I whispered to the water. "The table's still honest." Then I turned back toward the light of the restaurant, the faint hum of traffic, and the soft promise of tomorrow.